External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar has hit out at independent India's first Prime Minister Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru's China policy, saying he found it peculiar that China's interests were put ahead of India's interests when it came to the United Nations Security Council seat. Speaking to news agency ANI on his book, Bhai, Bharat Matters, Dr. S. Jaishankar was decoding the Narendra Modi government's foreign policy and said that there was realism in Prime Minister Narendra Modi's foreign policy. He spoke specifically of the China policy, saying that it followed the same line of thinking as independent India's first Home Minister and the Iron Man of India, Sardar Vallabh Patel. Elaborating on the other approach, or the Romanticism instead of realism approach of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, Dr. Jaishankar went on to say that when it came to the United Nations Security Council seat, to say we should first let China, or China's interest should come first, is a peculiar statement to make. Let's listen in to Dr. S. Jaishankar before I get you more on this big story.
I mean, where you know, even when it came, for example, to the UN Security Council seat. Now, again, it's not my case that we should have necessarily taken the seat. That's a different debate. But to say that, you know, we should first let China, you know, China's interests should come first. You know, that's a very it's a very peculiar statement to make. I argue for dealing with China from a basis of realism, that strain of realism which I feel extends all the way from Sardar Patel to Narendra Modi. That is the strain of realism which I feel should allow us to have a certain approach. The alternative strain, which starts from Nehru's, in a sense, China first policy, because he says, first let China take its seat, then we will see for India. So from China first policy, it ends up as Chindia policy.
That's a huge statement to make. I want to quickly bring in India Today's Shiv Arur for more on this story. Shiv, a bit of romanticism apart, to say that Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru followed a China first policy to the India first policy now, this is putting Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru directly in the line of fire when it comes to India's troubles with China, especially on the UN Security Council seat, Shiv.
Gaurav, for the last 4 years, the Congress and opposition parties have been talking about how, where is the Lal Aankh as far as the Modi government is concerned vis-a-vis China, especially after the standoff began in Ladakh. The facts on the ground and the perspective from all geopolitical and strategic experts is the biggest losses that India has faced, geopolitically in terms of territory, in terms of war, have all been under Congress or Congress-led governments, whether it is 1962, whether it is 1975, whether it is the Depsang and Demchok issues. Mind you, the only two outstanding issues between India and China, following the standoff, because all the friction points have resulted in, limited disengagements. But the two outstanding issues that the two sides are still talking about happen to be legacy issues that date back to either the UPA government or before. Now, the fact that the Jaishankar, the External Affairs Ministry, has drawn a comparison between the romanticism of Nehru and the realism of Sardar Patel, and drawing that parallel down to Congress governments and the Modi government, is extremely crucial, because this is precisely what the government's defense has actually been based on, saying, who are you to lecture us, especially at a time when we've deployed in a huge way precisely to try and prevent the kind of issues that your governments had created in the past. The romanticism of Nehru that the government and Jaishankar appears to be speaking about now is the huge strategic benefit of doubt that Nehru and Nehru's government, constantly and repeatedly gave to China over many, many different years in the 50s and the 60s, leading up to the 62 war. Yes. It was that kind of self-assuredness that China would never mean any harm, the fact that linkages between the two countries would never really result in any strategic attacks or takeover of territory, that resulted in the 62 war. And those lessons are precisely what has resulted in the realism that what Jaishankar says started or had its genesis in how Sardar Patel viewed China and has come down to how India has now reacted to China. Everything else, it appears, is just politics.
And that pragmatic approach was there right from the beginning when it comes to Sardar Vallabh Patel. And that approach was very different when it came to Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. And very specifically, here Dr. S. Jaishankar is directly talking about the United Nations Security Council seat, which could well have been a massive game changer for India right in the 1950s. The United States was talking about India being in the United Nations Security Council, and had sent out signals to Pandit Nehru, but he said China first. According to Dr. Jaishankar, history would have been very different had a more pragmatic approach been taken, Shiv.
Absolutely. Gaurav, when it comes to strategic follies or faux pas, the Nehru era provides, a great deal of data, a lot of instances and examples to pick up on at this time. Now, the Modi government is accused constantly of always picking up issues from the Nehru era or blaming things on Nehru. That's a matter of politics. But when it comes to the China issue, things are actually pretty valid here. The arguments are pretty valid, because whether it comes to, the ridiculous generosity in passing over the Security Council seat in favor of China, practically recommending China, to the kind of Hindi Chini Bhai bonhomie that preceded the 1962 war, the overconfidence in relations, all that boils down to how the leadership actually viewed China, how the leadership completely misread China's intentions. And that's the reason why you have the current government bring up Nehru, because you have to see it from not just Dr. S. Jaishankar's viewpoint, but also the government at large, Gaurav. Very, very simply put, it boils down to the government saying, who are you to tell us about a China policy when your entire legacy has been bending over backwards as far as China is concerned, and not knowing when the enemy was standing right in front of you? That is what the government is saying right now.
Shiv, keep tracking that story. I will come back to you for more very clearly. In fact, you'd recall Arun Jaitley, late Finance Minister of India, had also called Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru the original sinner when it came to foreign policy, especially on China and on Pakistan. But Prime Minister Narendra Modi's foreign policy has been talking about taking India's interests forward, and Dr. S. Jaishankar has described the past 10 years as the decade of transformation. He spoke of India-US, India-China, India-Pakistan, and even India-Canada relations, while speaking of India preparing for a larger global footprint in times to come, engaging with multiple international powers with no exclusivity in any relationship. And Bharat's spectacular success in the G20 was proof why Bharat matters. Combative and to the point, External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar started the new year with some straight talk on Pakistan.
What Pakistan was trying to do, not now, but over multiple decades, was really to use cross-border terrorism to bring India to the table. Okay, that in essence was its core policy. We have made that irrelevant by not playing that game. Now, it's not a case that we don't will not deal with a neighbor. After all, at the end of the day, a neighbor is a neighbor. But it is that we will not deal, on the basis of terms that they set, where the practice of terrorism is deemed as legitimate and effective in order to bring it to the table.
On the China front, the External Affairs Minister dismissed the charge of India losing in mind games to China.
No, I don't think we always lost out, but I would argue that at various points of time, when we talk about the parts of the past which today would be very difficult for someone to understand, the Panchsheel Agreement is another such example. The role of confidence, the role of assurance, the fact, we are multiple millennia civilization. All this should be in our demeanor, in our standing, and in the way in which we approach other countries.
In an exclusive interview to India Today, Prime Minister Narendra Modi had spoken about the Modi way. of dealing with Pakistan and China. He said, and we quote, "The Modi way of dealing with our neighbors is to be constructive and cooperative when required, and equally to be firm and steadfast when needed, both on initiatives and challenges. You can see the difference with the past," unquote. The other festering foreign affairs issue for India is that of Khalistan extremism and terrorism. The External Affairs Minister minced no words in exposing the hypocrisy of the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in fanning the Khalistan fire against India.
Hard is the fact that in Canadian politics, these Khalistani forces have been given a lot of space and have been allowed to indulge in activities which I think are damaging to the relationship, clearly not in India's interest, but I would argue not in Canada's interest either.
A new resurgent Bharat is dealing with the world on Bharat's own terms. Bureau Report, India Today. And joining me on the broadcast is Ambassador Vivek Kaju, former Secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs. Also with me on the broadcast, Sushant Sareen, Senior Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, and Sanjay Jha, Political Analyst. Sushant Sareen, Dr. Jaishankar has taken the battle right into the Congress camp on the issue of the United Nations Security Council seat. The EM saying that this charge is extremely serious. The fact that the EM says that China's interests should come first is very peculiar, accusing Nehru of putting China first.
Yeah, so some of it, Gaurav, is a kind of a political statement. But I think on the larger point, where Pandit Nehru's own letters say that, we have to first, we are okay even if we are going to get a seat to the United Nations Security Council, but first China must be accommodated out there, to something to that effect. I'm paraphrasing. Clearly, I think Dr. Jaishankar hits the nail on the head when he says that, look, how can the Prime Minister of a country put the interests of another country before his own country? Now, at best, this is romanticism. At worst, this is naivety. I certainly won't accuse Nehru of being disloyal to this country. That is certainly not my case. But yeah, there was this thing that, you want to appear to be very nice to some countries like China and some of the other countries. We've done the same thing with Pakistan. We've done the same thing with many other countries where we say, no, you have to first take care of their interests. In the real world, you have to put your country's interest uppermost above everything else.
Okay.
And, all this virtue signaling which was done in the past simply so that you appear to be nice to countries like China hasn't really paid off. How did it pay off? And once again, Gaurav, it's extremely important to understand that Pandit Nehru was nobody's fool. At the time when he was saying all this, he was also mindful of what the Chinese were up to.
Yes.
And he knew what the Chinese ingress into India is. He knew all of that. Now, I don't know whether this was part of his diplomatic thing that, you don't grab that seat from China and then China will become more reasonable. I don't know if it was about that. But the fact remains that he knew what China was up to, and yet he put China's interest over India's.
Putting China's interest over India. Sanjay Jha, this charge was leveled by Arun Jaitley when he called Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru the original sinner, quoting what at that time was described as Nehru's August 2nd, 1955 letter to chief ministers. Dr. Jaishankar says it's a major change, the China policy followed by the Narendra Modi government compared to the policy that was followed earlier, Sanjay Jha.
Gaurav, let me make two short points. Number one, this is not a book written by a diplomat. This is a politician following the playbook of the BJP. I read, or rather, I even saw some of the snippets of his interview given to ANI. He talks, the book itself is called Why Bharat Matters. And Mr. Jaishankar has the audacity to say that India's mindset and spirit and self-confidence and identity has emerged after 2014. I think it is an insult to India's politicians, technocrats, businessmen, farmers, laborers, students, the startups, and to media, to everybody to believe that India has only developed a certain steely confidence after 2014. I would like to with due respects to Mr. Jaishankar, say he needs to know his own political history. But the second point on Mr. Nehru is critical. And this is why I believe this is a brazen election campaign effort done by Mr. Jaishankar. And I will debunk his lie on your program. This is, Gaurav, you have been a friend, and I think you're a very responsible anchor. Let me quote to you what Pandit Nehru said on the floor of the House in Parliament on 27th of September 1955 to a question asked to him on the whole question of has India got an offer from the United States on becoming a permanent member of the UN Security Council. These are the words of Pandit Nehru as the Prime Minister of the country. The Prime Minister said, there has been no offer, formal or informal, of this kind. Some vague references have appeared in the press about it, which have no foundation in fact. The composition of the Security Council is prescribed by the Charter of the United Nations, and according to that, only a decision can be taken. So the question of India accepting or rejecting such a decision was out of the question. And here is the second point. Who is the United States or Russia to make an offer to India? I mean, any decision would have to be made by the UN Charter itself amending its own constitution. I mean, this is basically an exaggeration played out by the right wing, and I think it needs to be debunked publicly.
Let me get Ambassador Karju to weigh in on this. Ambassador Karju, Dr. Jaishankar has been quoted as saying, when it came to the UNSC seat, to say China should get it first, China's interest should come first, is a very peculiar statement to make. What do you make of it? Because this charge was also leveled by late Arun Jaitley, and if I may, he says Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru's infamous letter to chief ministers dated August 2, 1955 states, informally suggestions have been made by the United States that China should be taken into the United Nations but not in the Security Council, and that India should take her place in the Security Council. We cannot, of course, accept this, as it means falling out with China. It would be very unfair for a great country like China not to be in the Security Council, unquote. Ambassador Karju.
Well, I have great respect for my old colleague Jaishankar. I think he was an excellent diplomat. His foreign secretaryship was richly deserved, and he is now the External Affairs Minister. His knowledge of these things is far more than mine, but if I recollect correctly, I think the Chinese were permanent members of the Security Council right from the beginning. China, it so happened that it was not Beijing after 1949, after the communist takeover. It was really Taiwan which was the member. Therefore, the Americans, to my mind, when I read all this, this is not new.
True.
What Jaishankar has said is old stuff. But when I read this, the first thought that struck me was that the Americans had dangled a carrot. Let us not forget that this is 1955, the height of the Cold War. The Soviets were courting us, so were the Americans, and we were pursuing a policy of non-alignment. Also recollect that in 1954, the Americans had aligned themselves with the Pakistanis. The Pakistanis had become alliance partners of America. Therefore, there was a full context here. And I for one, cannot imagine that the Russians would have exceeded. If you recollect, the Soviet-Chinese problem began later. It hadn't surfaced in 1955. So I can't imagine that the Soviets would have acquiesced in throwing out the Chinese and putting in India as a member of the Security Council. So Jaishankar is saying, is making a statement which I, for one, find difficult to accept. Now, that doesn't mean that Nehru didn't make mistakes in his China policy. Of course he did. But I can also think that there was, I mean, if you are saying of Romanticism in an approach to China, then let me ask, and ask with great humility, was there not a little Romanticism in the early years of the Modi regime, the Modi government with regard to China? Wasn't there an attempt at personal diplomacy between which Prime Minister Modi embarked on and which was endorsed by Jaishankar? He should read his remarks to the to the Singapore Security Dialogue of 2015. And when he's lauding the role of personal chemistry in international affairs,
which he does even in this book, you know, when he's talking about chemistry and credibility, both very extensively. But the point remains: is there a shift to realism?
One second.
Go on, Ambassador Kajju.
Has that worked? We've tried realism. We have even gone to the Prime Minister, and rightly has said, Atmanirbhar Bharat, manufacturing must increase, imports from China must decrease. After that call, have imports from China decreased? These are hard questions that have to be asked. Yep. We have to ask ourselves these questions.
Okay, Sushant Sareen wants to come in. Sushant Sareen wants to come in. Ambassador Kajju, imports from China, one aspect, but India is not letting China walk all over us, or are we, when you put 50,000 troops on the line of actual control and do not permit Chinese...
I have a point there.
Go on.
The Chinese want this because the Chinese can outspend us. Of course, we are doing the right thing by putting troops. The Chinese can't walk over us. They can't be allowed. 1962 was a disaster. We can never forget that. And today, India of 2024 is a different India, and the Chinese know that.
Okay.
But the fact is that the LAC today is costing us far more, and the Chinese economy is 6 times ours. We can't follow the path of Pakistan, who have ruined themselves by trying to meet us on a confrontational basis. Now, which doesn't mean that we become defensive with China. I think our Chinese policy today is correct. But the point is that when you evaluate these things, then you can evaluate them strategically.
Fair
or
enough.
You can evaluate them politically.
Sushant Sareen, you wanted to comment on the aspect of imports from China remaining extremely high at a time when the effort is to bring in more realism in the relationship.
Gaurav, I'm not getting your audio very clearly, so I can't really hear. I've missed the last part of Mr. Kajju's thing. But if you allow me to come on the earlier part of Mr. Kajju, what he was saying.
Okay.
You know, again, to call Mr. Modi's initial interactions with the Chinese president romanticism, I think Mr. Kajju is being a little disingenuous out here. You know, in diplomacy, and he's a seasoned diplomat, in diplomacy, you certainly meet people, you certainly put your best foot forward. But if you remember very clearly, even at the time that Xi Jinping had come to India, there was an incident which was taking place along Eastern Ladakh, right? And what was the Indian reaction? And what was the tone and tenor in which the Indian side responded? And this was a government which was, I think, maybe just about a month into office, maybe a little more. I don't remember the exact date. So the point is that you put your best foot forward, but you also dug in your heels where you needed to. Number one. Number two, yes, as a part of diplomacy, you continue to engage with the Chinese, but you didn't give in on anything to them. And to say that the Chinese want you to put your troops along the border because then they will outspend you, then let's not put any troops along the border. Then everybody can outspend you.
What are you talking about?
No, one second, sir. Please let me complete because I can't hear what is being said. So let me just have my say. So I don't agree with that. And finally, on this whole question of imports, Gaurav, on this whole question of imports, the bottom line is that, you know, ask anybody on critical infrastructure and imports are more or less stopped from China. On a range of other things, we are asking companies to start manufacturing in India. This is not something, this is not a light switch which will happen. You switch on a light and suddenly all the production will happen in India and you don't need China after that. In fact, even after you become Atmanirbhar, you will continue to deal with China at an economic level because after all, it's the second largest economy in the world. You can't completely ignore them.
Yes.
The Americans have not been able to do it. So to expect us that we'll be able to do it overnight simply because the Prime Minister has rooted in favor of Atmanirbhar Bharat, which is exactly what we should be doing, I think that's rather unfair. And finally, on all this whole, this Nehru controversy, see, the bottom line is that whatever the international context, and we can have arguments on that, but I think the primary thing is that when Pandit Nehru writes to the chief ministers and he says that China is this great country and China must be there, it's only after that we will come in. The point is that you are putting in China's interest first in a written letter to Indian chief ministers. And the fact was that while Taiwan had been given China's seat, this is an informal kind of a sounding out of that you bring in India rather than China, that China is not interested, so you keep China out and you bring India in. We should have played with it. Why didn't we play with it? We should have seen how far it goes. We should have seen where the Soviets stand. We should have seen where the Chinese stand. Where the Americans stand and where the Brits and the French will stand.
So we should have put Indian national interest first.
Pandit Nehru was this great guy. I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't agree with that form of diplomacy.
Fair enough. Ambassador Kaju wants to come in as does Sanjay Jha. But Ambassador Kaju, you want to quickly respond to Sushant Sareen on the letter to the Chief Minister, especially that aspect. Why not put Indian interest first?
Look, I can't imagine any Indian Prime Minister who has not put Indian interest first. Starting from Prime Minister Nehru,
Okay, give me a moment as I try and establish.
Prime Minister Modi is a patriot. He has put he has put Indian interests first, and so I believe that Pandit Nehru put Indian interests first. Now we can disagree. We can disagree with certain phraseology that he had used. We can disagree with his approach to China in the context of 62. But the point is that his reading, I believe, in 1955 was...
Okay, give me a moment as we try and reestablish that link with you, sir. The loss of Aksai Chin, Panchsheel, Hindi Chini, Bhai, the run-up to 62, the defeat in 1962, where ill-prepared soldiers were pushed at the line of actual control or the borders to face China, the statement about Assam, and my heart goes out to Assam. What does all of that indicate? Does it indicate a certain degree of romanticism, far removed from realism? But Sanjay Jha, this isn't restricted just to China. Even on Pakistan, Dr. Jaishankar says that Pakistan's policy of using terror as a means to get India to the talks table is no longer working. That's off the table. Sanjay Jha on Pakistan.
Gaurav, I can tell you that Mr. Jaishankar has failed as a foreign minister of India. And I repeat it again, because I know he's got these cult followers. I will give you two evidence of that. Number one, look at India's neighborhood policy. You are today literally surrounded by states which have become friendlier towards China. Maldives has officially pivoted towards China. We know the investments in Sri Lanka are resulting in a political asymmetrical imbalance. You look at Bhutan and Nepal, they are all actually now, kind of pussyfooting with China very openly. And of course, I think these are all significant messages of the kind of risks we are exposing ourselves to. Not to forget, obviously, about the risks of a two-front war with the Pakistan-China axis. How can Mr. Jaishankar use hyperbole to dodge this reality? Point number two, he talks about India's prestige, etc. Let me tell you, I think Mr. Jaishankar should read the foreign media that he clearly has contempt for, because that is an equal determinant of your global reputation. And the truth is that on democracy, on sectarianism, on the death of India's institutions, India is taking an extremely nasty hit all over the world. Obviously, you're a big economy, foreign powers will quote you. Everyone wants to go to a big consumer market and a cheap labor market. But that has nothing to do with Modi. Anyone who becomes the prime minister in 2024 will reap the harvest of a country which has a certain threshold of a GDP size. And the last point before I conclude, I think Smita Prakash asked him a question on the issue of all these, the issues in Canada and the recent US government inquiry into the attempt to murder a Sikh separatist. And Mr. Jaishankar, like his guru, Mr. Modi, actually told her, no questions, please. This is not a press conference. So
No,
I
but he
think
did answer the question on, he did answer the question on Canada, where he said, give us evidence, we'll look at it.
Yeah, but
he
I
did
thought
respond.
the way he's no, Gaurav, I think he stonewalled that conversation. I thought Smita Prakash did ask him to kind of elaborate, because the Indian government has said we will inquire into whatever are the allegations made. At least
no, but why would we think that the Western media? I'm sorry, I disagree with you. Very respectfully, Sanjay Jha, on why should we accept what the Western media may write as the gospel? You're an Indian citizen. You know what's happening in our country. You don't want Western validation, do you? But let me get Sushant Sareen. Let me get Sushant Sareen to respond to that. No, because there is such uninformed commentary that's happening in a section of the Western media. I'm surprised we should even consider what the Western media writes, and especially when there are some articles that write that Russia is India's new best friend. Really? New best friend? But Sushant Sareen, you wanted to come in both on the aspect of Pakistan and Canada.
Yeah, but Gaurav, on the Western media, not only do people like Mr. Jha look for validation from the Western media, they actually look for intervention from the West to try and make India a more democratic country. From the United States, where a presidential candidate is being debarred and not being allowed to contest, from countries in Europe which are electing leaders which Mr. Jha would certainly not countenance, and yet it's democracy in India that is affected, and which is why these guys are going all over the world trying to lobby for support so that India is bad-mouthed, India is dissed, and these guys think that that will get them votes in Bhagalpur and Bhiwandi and all kinds of other places in this country. Good luck to them. On the issue of Pakistan, Gaurav, I think what the Prime Minister, what the Foreign Minister said was correct. But I think even on Pakistan, that realism in India's policy came after the Uri attacks and the first surgical strikes. We took it up one notch after the Pulwama attacks, and now it has become a policy. But I don't think the Pakistanis have changed their policy of using terrorism to try and bring India onto the table. And you will see that in recent statements, including of Shahbaz Sharif, whose lexicon is a little challenged, so he thinks what is happening in Kashmir is a genocide. He probably never saw the pictures of Lal Chowk on the 31st December night, because in Lahore and everywhere else, their puppet prime minister had banned all kinds of celebration. So Shahbaz Sharif is clearly challenged, and he's trying to suck up to the army like the other politicians. The army itself has come out with statements which are obnoxious, to say the least. And you have the Pakistani Foreign Office make its, typical vituperative comments on India. So I don't think the Pakistani policy on India has changed. But I suspect that, maybe Mr. Jaishankar might just have left a little opening for the Pakistanis, that in case they want to, re-engage with India at a political level, we are ready to do it. But he also made it very clear that we haven't completely broken off engagement, which we cannot, because simply because, you're neighboring countries, so you have to do some business of state with each other. But beyond that, I don't think this relationship with Pakistan is going to go anywhere.
And, if Pakistan engages with us after 370, well, it's good. It's good. They've accepted the reality of 370. But Ambassador Kajju, you've dealt with Pakistan all through your career, sir. First time I met you, you were JS Spy. Do you notice a change in the policy that was followed earlier? Okay, I still do not have that link with Ambassador Kajju. Sushant Sareen, quickly, Sanjay Jha, you wanted to come in, sir.
Yeah, I wanted to make this point here that, it is very easy for Sushant Sareen to say, just kind of trash the Western media. But this is the same foreign minister. This is the same Mr. Modi who are actually very happy to become the bulwark for United States to contain China as part of their policy here, which are very happy to attract FDI investment, which are very happy to say that this is what Biden said about Trump, Biden and Trump said about Modi. But hang on, when the New York Times or the Western media says that Indian democracy or Indian communalism is raging, then you say, well, kindly ignore them. What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. That hypocrisy doesn't work. And I think Mr. Jaishankar had to defend Ab Ki Baar Trump Sarkar, which I thought was the most embarrassing diplomatic gaffe in India's diplomatic history.
Okay, if I were to come back to the Pakistan policy, post Pulwama, Ambassador Kaju, do you notice a change? Dr. Jaishankar says Pakistan's policy of using terror as a means to get India to the talks table isn't working.
No, I think the Pakistan policy after Balakot has been the correct policy, and I believe that the Modi government has done the right thing in this. But let us not also overlook the fact that it took some time to reach this position. So, as always, there is continuity and change in policies. And today, I welcome the the policy that is being pursued with Pakistan. It took some time in coming to this position. It took the tragedy of Pulwama to come to this position, but now that it has reached this, and the fact that they've pursued it for 5 years is right. All the time we were saying terror and talks can't go together, and since 2019, we've pursued this policy, and I only hope we will continue to pursue this policy, because this is something that I believe in, and I personally was advocating it from the 1990s.
Oh, absolutely. I remember reporting on it since the mid-1990s when you were JS spy. The terror and talks do not go simultaneously. And I will let that be the last word on the show. Ambassador Kaju, Sanjay Jha and Sushant Sareen for joining me on this India Today special. Many thanks.